Sign it. This is how family works. You carry your share.
I've seen the accounts, Clifford. I know what's already out there under my name.
You're overreacting. It's paperwork. You're good for it.
This is our last chance, sweetheart. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not signing.
Then you don't get to live under this roof either. We gave you a home.
All right.
Pack your bags. Tonight.
The night my stepfather pointed to the door and told me to pack my bags, he genuinely believed he had won. Within the hour, string lights went up in the yard. My brother posted a video online calling it peace. My mother stood in the doorway and said nothing. What none of them knew was that I had already made one quiet, irreversible move. I left without argument. I carried a folder and let them celebrate. The question is, what happens when 30 envelopes land at a doorstep that can no longer pay for a single one of them? If you've ever been the person quietly holding everything together while everyone else took credit, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay with this channel every week. We share stories about people who chose themselves when no one else would. The night I drove away from that house, the string lights were already up in the yard. I could see them in my rearview mirror, warm and yellow, swaying a little in the October wind. My brother had his phone out before I even reached the end of the block, filming the kind of video he thought was funny. My mother stood just inside the front door. Not outside, not waving. Just watching through the glass like I was a problem that had finally sorted itself out. I had lived in that house for 7 years. I had paid for it for almost all of them. It started the year I was 24, right after my father died. My mother had remarried Clifford 2 years before that, a man with rough hands, strong opinions, and a business that always seemed to be one slow quarter away from turning a corner. When my father passed, I came back to Kentwood because my mother called me every other night saying she was scared. She said Clifford's auto detailing shop was bleeding money. She said the mortgage company had sent a letter. She said she didn't know what they were going to do. I had a stable job, a paycheck that came every 2 weeks without fail, and the kind of guilt that only daughters carry when their mothers cry on the phone. So I came home. I told myself it would be a few months. A few months became a year became 3 became 7. At first, I covered the mortgage because it was the most urgent thing. Then the electricity bill came due the same week. Clifford said the shop's checking account was short, so I covered that too. Then the gas. Then the water. Then Cody, my younger brother, 27 years old and allergic to steady employment, needed his car insurance renewed. And my mother looked at me across the dinner table in a way that made me open my phone and transfer the money before dessert. Phoebe's community college tuition. Groceries. The home security system Clifford insisted on after a neighbor's garage got broken into. The family phone plan that somehow included 4 lines, 3 of which were not mine. I paid for all of it. I told myself it was temporary every single time. That was the lie I kept alive the longest. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was that none of them ever acknowledged what the money actually meant. Clifford never said thank you, he said. Things like, that's what family does and you make good money. It's not a big deal for you. My mother nodded along when he said it, which was its own kind of answer. Cody would make jokes at dinner about how nice it must be to have a desk job, as though the reason I could pay 11 bills a month was because I sat in a comfortable chair. And when I tried to ask questions, when I pulled up a spreadsheet once and said we needed to talk about where the money was going, Clifford called me controlling. My mother said I was putting finances above family. I learned, slowly and then all at once, that in that house, asking where the money went was a personal attack. So I stopped asking. What I didn't stop doing was paying attention. About 3 months before that dinner with the loan papers, I found a letter tucked behind the stack of mail on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to me, but the return address was from a collections agency I didn't recognize. The account number meant nothing to me. The debt listed just over $2,000 was for a home repair service I had never contracted. I stood in that kitchen for a long time holding that envelope. Not angry yet, something colder than angry. The feeling of walking into a room and realizing someone had been there before you, going through your things and putting everything back almost exactly right. I didn't say anything that night. I took the letter to my room and called Renee. Renee had worked in credit fraud detection for years, and she was the kind of friend who picked up the phone at 10 at night and immediately understood why I was calling. She walked me through how to pull a full credit report. What we found took both of us quiet for a moment. There were accounts under my name I had never opened: a roof repair loan, an equipment lease, a business credit card. Some of them were years old. Some were still active. All of them had been opened using my correct social security number, my correct date of birth, my correct address, because it was their address too. Renee said she'd help me document everything. She said we needed to move carefully and not tip anyone off until we knew the full picture. By the time that dinner happened, we had identified 30 accounts and billing relationships tied to my name. The total across unpaid balances, overdue amounts, and active charges came to close to $29,000. I went to that dinner knowing all of it. I sat down at the table my mother had set with the placemats she bought the year I moved back in, and I watched Clifford put the loan application in front of me like he was doing me a favor by letting me sign it. He wanted $38,000 to expand the shop, a bigger facility, new equipment, more staff. He and Cody had been planning it for months. The problem was that neither of them could qualify for a loan on their own. Clifford's business credit was a disaster, and Cody had never held a job long enough to establish much of anything. What they needed was my name. My credit score. The 7 years I had spent building a financial record that was clean precisely because I had been disciplined about it, even while paying for everyone else. My mother presented it like an opportunity. She said this was the moment the family could finally get ahead. Cody said once the business took off, he would pay me back everything, every dollar I had ever put into the house, into his car, into all of it. He said it the way people say things they have no intention of making true. I told them no. Clifford's expression shifted in a way I had seen before, the slow tightening that happened when something didn't go according to his plan. He said I was trying to watch them fail. My mother's eyes filled, which they always did when a conversation wasn't going her way. She said I had changed since my last promotion, that I used to understand what family meant. Cody hit the table with his palm and said I was selfish, that I thought I was better than them because I worked in an office. The three of them talked over each other for a while, each coming at me from a different angle, and I sat with my hands flat on the table and said nothing, because I had already made my decision weeks before that dinner, and nothing in that room was going to change it. Then Clifford said it. He said if I wasn't willing to contribute to this family, I didn't have the right to live under their roof. He said it plainly, like a business term, like he was explaining a clause in a contract. My mother looked at the table. She did not say a single word in my defense. She gave me until sunset to pack my things. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I had been paying that mortgage for years. My name was on more of that house's financial history than Clifford's was. I knew things about what had been done with my credit that could have changed the entire conversation in an instant, and I said none of it. Not because I was afraid, and not because I was being gracious. I said nothing because I was following a plan, and the plan required that I leave without showing my hand. Clifford and Cody carried my bags to the front porch. My mother stood in the doorway and said that someday I would understand what I had thrown away. It was a strange thing to say to someone who had been paying to keep the lights on. Phoebe was the only one who didn't follow the script. She was 20 and still living at home while she finished her first year at the community college, and she had watched 7 years of the same thing I had lived through, just from a different angle. She found me on the porch while I was loading the last box into my car. She didn't say much. She asked if I was going to be okay. I told her I was. Then I told her not to stand near the front door when the mail arrived in 3 days. She looked at me for a moment and seemed to understand more than I said out loud. By the time I pulled out of the driveway, Clifford had already plugged in the string lights. I could hear music from inside the house. Later that night, Cody posted a video of the family raising glasses in the living room with a caption about how the house finally had some peace. My mother was smiling in the background. They all looked genuinely relieved. I drove to Renee's apartment, sat at her kitchen table, and we went through the documentation one more time. Every account, every balance, every address on file. Everything Renee had already helped me prepare was in order: the credit freeze, the stopped automatic payments, the forwarding requests that would redirect every bill tied to my name to the actual address of the service being used, which was, in every single case, the house I had just left. I hadn't told the electric company I was moving out of anger. I had told them because I was no longer the person responsible for that service, and the paperwork simply needed to reflect reality. The same was true for the gas, the water, the internet, the home insurance, the car insurance, the shop accounts, Cody's phone, the equipment leases, 30 accounts, 30 billing addresses, all of them now correctly pointing to the house on the other side of town where the string lights were still glowing. In 3 days, the mail would arrive. I didn't sleep much that first night, but it wasn't because I was upset. It was because I kept running through the list in my head, not out of anxiety, but the way you check a task before you close a file. Making sure nothing was missed. Making sure every piece was exactly where I had put it. The house had been kept alive by my name for 7 years. Now my name was gone. And in 72 hours, every institution that had ever sent a bill to that address would be sending it again this time, with no automatic payment waiting on the other end. I thought about the string lights. I thought about the video Cody posted. I thought about my mother's smile in the background, the way she looked lighter, like something had been resolved. I turned off the lamp in Renee's guest room and stared at the ceiling in the dark. 3 days. The morning of the 3rd day, I was sitting at Renee's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold when my phone lit up with my mother's name. I let it ring. It rang again 4 minutes later. Then Cody called. Then a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Clifford calling from the shop's landline. I set the phone face down on the table and listened to the notifications stack up like a slow drum beat. I already knew what had arrived at the house. Renee had walked me through what to expect, not 1 or 2 envelopes, but a full tray's worth. Because the billing cycles for 30 accounts don't all fall on the same day, but the forwarding requests had been processed together. The post office had held them and delivered the batch all at once. 30 envelopes, some white and standard, some the kind with the red urgent stripe across the top. The electric company, the gas company, the home insurance carrier, internet, water, the security system, the equipment leases tied to Clifford's shop, the fuel card, the business liability policy. The credit accounts flagged for fraud review. All of it, addressed to the people actually living at the service address, arriving on a Tuesday morning while my family was still operating under the assumption that I would eventually come back. My mother's voicemail was tearful. She said I was doing this on purpose, that I was trying to make them lose the house, that she couldn't believe her own daughter could be this cruel. Cody's messages were not tearful. They were the kind of texts that arrive in rapid succession, each one a little angrier than the last, the grammar degrading as he went. He said I had no right to cut off payments without warning. He said I was going to destroy everything Clifford had worked for. The irony of that particular sentence was not lost on me. Clifford's message was different. He kept his voice measured, almost pleasant, and said there had clearly been some kind of paperwork mix-up and he was sure we could sort it out quickly if I called him back. I texted all 3 of them the same response. I told them there was no mix-up. The bills had simply arrived at the correct address for the first time in years. The calls did not stop. When I didn't respond, the messages changed tone. My mother started telling neighbors that I had abandoned her. She told my aunt in Ohio that I had walked out over a family disagreement and refused to help during a crisis. Cody posted another video less celebratory than the first one, more aggrieved, in which he explained, without a hint of self-awareness, that his sister had been managing the family finances for years and was now using that control as a weapon. He presented this as though it were an injustice done to him. He had nearly 400 comments agreeing with him by the end of the day. Then Clifford came to my office. I was at my desk on a Thursday afternoon when one of the front desk staff called up to say there was a man in the lobby asking for me, that he was being loud and refusing to wait. I knew before I even took the elevator down. Clifford was standing in the center of the lobby with his jacket on and his jaw set, and when he saw me step out, he didn't lower his voice. He told the security guard and the receptionist and the 2 people waiting on the side bench that I had been controlling his family's finances for years and was now retaliating against them because I'd been asked to move out. He used the word retaliation 4 times. He said I had the financial knowledge to do real damage and that I was using it. I stood about 6 feet away from him and did not raise my voice. I reached into my jacket pocket, took out the card Monica had given me, and held it out toward him. I told him that any further conversation about money or accounts needed to go through my attorney. He stared at the card like it had been written in another language. He didn't take it. But something in his expression shifted when I said the word attorney, and then again, more noticeably, when I said the phrase, identity theft investigation. He left without saying anything else. I rode the elevator back up, sat down at my desk, and opened the file I'd been working on before he arrived. My hands were steady, but I sat with what had just happened for a long time before I actually read a single word on the screen. He had walked into the place I had spent years building a reputation, and he had done it without hesitation. That told me something I already suspected, but had not fully accepted. Until that moment, there was no version of this situation in which Clifford would choose dignity over pressure. He would use every tool available to him, and I needed to be ready for that. Phoebe called that night. She had stayed quiet through most of the chaos, watching from inside the house, and what she told me shifted everything. Clifford had gathered the family that evening and told them they needed to get their story straight. He said that if anyone asked a lawyer, an investigator, anyone official, they should say that Sabrina had been fully aware of every account opened in her name, that she had agreed to use her credit to help the family and was now pretending otherwise out of spite. He told Cody and my mother to stick to that version. He told Phoebe too. She said she hadn't agreed, and she hadn't said anything to him one way or another. But she called me as soon as she could get to a quiet room. I called Monica that night and told her what Phoebe had said. Monica told me we needed to move to a formal mediation before Clifford could build that narrative any further. The meeting was held at Monica's office 10 days later. Clifford and my mother came together, dressed carefully, composed in the way people are when they've rehearsed. Clifford spoke first. He said I had agreed to use my credit to help the family because I understood it was a shared sacrifice. He said every account had been opened with my full knowledge. My mother confirmed everything he said, sitting beside him with her hands folded in her lap, nodding at each point like she was affirming facts rather than constructing a story. Stripped of context, it could look like participation. Many of the accounts had been opened from the Kentwood address. The information used was accurate, and some payments had come from my bank account because for years I had been the one paying everything. For a moment it was working. I sat across the table from my mother and watched her describe a version of our life together that inverted every fact she knew to be true. I understood something about her in that moment that I hadn't let myself understand before. She wasn't confused. She wasn't being led. She had chosen this, clearly and deliberately, the same way she had chosen to say nothing when Clifford told me to pack my bags. Then the door opened and Phoebe walked in. She was carrying her phone. She said she had recorded the family conversation 3 weeks earlier, the night I was asked to leave because she was frightened and didn't know what else to do. She played it through the small speaker, and the room went very still. Clifford's voice came through clearly. He said they had used my credit because I had the best score and because I was responsible for the family regardless. My mother's voice followed, saying I didn't need to know about every account because I was always going to be the one paying. The recording ran for 4 minutes and left no reasonable interpretation. They had known. They had discussed it openly, and they had deliberately kept me uninformed. Clifford turned on Phoebe immediately. His composure broke all at once, and what came out underneath it was uglier than anything he'd said to me. My mother called her youngest daughter a traitor. Cody, reached by phone that evening, told Phoebe she was no longer welcome in the house if she refused to retract what she'd done. The mediation ended without resolution, but Monica told me privately that the recording had fundamentally changed the legal character of the situation. We were no longer talking about a billing dispute. We were potentially talking about fraud. Clifford understood that too. Within the week, he had filed a formal complaint with my employer, accusing me of using my auditing skills to manipulate family financial accounts. It was a specific and calculated accusation, specific enough that my company's HR department had no choice but to open an internal review. Because I worked in payroll auditing, any allegation involving financial misconduct had to be taken seriously, regardless of where it originated. I was placed on administrative suspension while the review was conducted. On the same day, the apartment complex I had applied to informed me that my credit file showed unresolved discrepancies and they could not finalize my lease until the accounts were cleared. In the span of 72 hours, I had lost my income temporarily and my housing options simultaneously. My mother called that evening, and her voice was back to the version she used when she wanted something soft, a little tired, the one that had worked on me for most of my adult life. She said it didn't have to go any further. She said if I withdrew the fraud report and agreed to resume payments on the most critical accounts, Clifford would retract the complaint to my employer. She said we could call it a misunderstanding and move on. She made it sound like a compromise between two equal parties who had simply gotten their wires crossed. I listened to her all the way through, and when she finished, I understood more clearly than I ever had before that what she was describing was not a compromise. It was the same arrangement we had always had, with a new enforcement mechanism attached. She wasn't asking me to rejoin the family. She was asking me to go back to being useful to them. 3 days after that call, Clifford told Phoebe she had until the end of the week to leave the house. She showed up at Renee's apartment with a single bag and the look of someone who had been expecting it. I used the last of what I'd set aside for my apartment deposit to rent a 2-bedroom unit in a temporary housing complex across town. It wasn't much: 2 beds, a small kitchen, a window that looked out at a parking structure. Phoebe put her bag on the second bed and didn't complain once. Monica called the following morning. She laid it out plainly. The only path to fully removing the fraudulent accounts from my credit record was to file a sworn affidavit confirming that I had not authorized their creation. If I filed it, the investigation would likely reach Clifford, and given the recording, the camera records from equipment vendors, and the digital trail showing the accounts had been opened from his office computer during hours I was verifiably at work, he would almost certainly face a formal fraud inquiry. My mother, who had been present for the recorded conversation, could face civil liability as well. If I did not file it, I would remain attached to a debt load that wasn't mine, with a suspended job and no approved housing. That night, Phoebe fell asleep early. I sat at the small table near the window with Monica's paperwork in front of me and the parking structure lights making pale rectangles on the wall. I had spent 7 years telling myself that staying quiet was a form of love, that absorbing the consequences was what holding a family together looked like. What I was sitting with now was the other side of that belief, the part I hadn't let myself look at directly until there was nothing left between me and it. The question was never really whether to sign the affidavit. The question was whether I believed I was worth protecting, whether what had been done to me was serious enough to name out loud, even if naming it caused damage to people I had once organized my entire life around. I looked at Phoebe asleep on the second bed. She had handed over that recording, knowing exactly what it would cost her. She had done it because she thought the truth mattered more than the peace it would disturb. I picked up the pen, signed my name at the bottom of the affidavit, and set it face down on the table. Something was ending. Something that had taken 7 years to name was finally being named. And whatever came next, at least it would be built on what was actually true. The affidavit moved faster than I expected. Monica had told me the credit institutions would conduct their own investigation before making any determinations, and that I should prepare for it to take time. What I hadn't anticipated was how much of the evidence already existed in places none of us had to go looking for. The digital records did the work on their own. The account applications had been submitted from an IP address registered to Clifford's shop. The timestamps placed the submissions on weekday afternoons when my employee badge logs showed me swiping in and out of my company's building across town. The email address used to create electronic signatures was a secondary account Clifford had built using a slight variation of my name, registered to his shop's address. The equipment vendor 2 counties over had camera footage of Clifford signing for a delivery of industrial polishing machines purchased through a credit line opened in my name. The recording Phoebe had made filled in the last piece, it showed that my mother had known, had discussed it plainly, and had made a deliberate choice to keep me uninformed because I would continue paying regardless. Monica called to walk me through each piece as it was confirmed. She spoke in the careful, measured way she always did, but I could hear something underneath it, not quite satisfaction, but the particular steadiness of someone watching a case resolve the way the facts said it should. When she finished, she said the findings were sufficient. The institutions would move forward with removing the fraudulent accounts from my record. One final meeting was requested, not a mediation this time, but a formal session with the investigators and both parties present. Clifford came. My mother came. They looked smaller somehow, in that room, than they had in Monica's office weeks earlier. The careful composure they'd worn to the mediation was gone. What was left was just 2 people who had run out of versions of the story that worked. Clifford made one last attempt. He said everything he had done was to keep the family from losing everything, the house, the business, the life they had built. He said that if I had been willing to simply continue helping, none of this would have happened. He said it without apparent irony, which told me he had been living inside that logic for so long that it had stopped feeling like an excuse and started feeling like a fact. My mother sat beside him and said nothing this time. She didn't confirm his account or add to it. She just looked at the table, which was its own kind of admission. I said what I had decided I would say, and I kept it short. I told them I wasn't asking for anyone to go to prison. I wasn't asking for punishment beyond what the situation itself had already produced. But I would not stand in front of investigators and say that what had been done to my credit was done with my knowledge, because it wasn't, and the evidence had already made that plain to everyone in the room. I told Clifford that protecting myself was not the same as attacking him. And then I stopped talking, because everything that needed to be said had been said. The hardest moment wasn't facing Clifford. It was looking at my mother across that table and understanding that she was not going to say she was sorry. Not that day, and probably not for a long time, if ever. She had made her choices incrementally, over years, in small moments where she could have spoken up and didn't. That kind of accumulation doesn't unwind in a single afternoon. I had spent most of my adult life hoping that one right conversation would fix something structural, and sitting in that room finally let me put that hope down. The resolution came in stages over the following weeks, and none of it was dramatic. The 5 fraudulent accounts were formally removed from my credit record. My employer completed their internal review and found no evidence of misconduct on my part. The complaint Clifford had filed had no supporting documentation, and the timeline of the actual fraud pointed entirely in the other direction. My manager called me personally to say I was reinstated and that the company considered the matter closed. He used the phrase "handled with integrity," which I wrote down in the small notebook I kept on my desk, because I wanted to remember it accurately. Clifford's situation resolved with less noise than I had expected, though not without consequence. Faced with the digital evidence and Phoebe's recording, he negotiated a settlement rather than contest a fraud investigation. He admitted responsibility for the unauthorized accounts, signed a repayment agreement, and liquidated most of the shop's equipment to begin covering what was owed. The detailing business closed by the end of that month. The expanded facility he and Cody had been planning never materialized because there was no longer a credit line to build it on and no longer a business to justify the space. Cody's consequences arrived more quietly, the way they do for people who were always passengers in someone else's plan. The services tied to his name were terminated as each billing cycle came due and went unpaid. His car, a lease he'd never been able to afford on his own income, was surrendered when the payments stopped. He found a full-time job within 6 weeks, which was the fastest he had ever done anything. I heard this from Phoebe, not from him. He never contacted me directly, which I understood. Some people find it easier to rebuild in the direction that doesn't require them to look at what they've done. My mother kept the house, though it cost her more than the house itself. The mortgage lender worked with her on a restructured payment plan, but the monthly amount she now had to cover on her own was enough that she converted the upstairs into a rentable unit and found a tenant by the end of the summer. She cut every subscription, every optional expense, every convenience she had taken for granted when I was the one covering it. It was, in the most precise sense, her actual life, the one that had always been there underneath the version I had been subsidizing. Phoebe found her footing faster than anyone. She applied for a need-based scholarship she had always been eligible for but had never needed to pursue, got it, and moved into campus housing before the next semester started. She picked up part-time work at the college library, which suited her quiet, structured, surrounded by things that held still. I helped her cover the gap between the scholarship and her first paycheck, and we wrote down the amount, the date, and a repayment timeline. Not because I didn't trust her, but because we had both learned that clarity is a form of respect. She paid me back in 4 installments, each one arriving exactly when she said it would. 6 months after the night, Clifford pointed to the door and told me to leave. I signed a lease. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a converted building along the Grand River, an old furniture warehouse that someone had spent years turning into something livable. The ceilings were high, the windows were large, and everything in it was going to be mine. I stood in the empty living room on the afternoon. I got the keys and thought about what it meant to live somewhere where nothing had been carried by anyone else's silence. Every bill in this apartment would arrive with my name on it because I had chosen to put my name on it. Every payment would be a decision I made with my own eyes open. Renee and Monica came that first evening, and Phoebe arrived straight from campus with a grocery bag over one shoulder and a bakery box in the other hand. She had bought a small cake white with plain frosting and the kind of candles that come in a pack of 24 and take 2 minutes to light. We sat on the floor of the living room because I didn't have furniture yet, and we ate cake off paper plates and talked about things that had nothing to do with credit reports or affidavits or any of the preceding 6 months. It was exactly what I needed it to be: ordinary and warm and chosen. Every person there because they had decided to be. Phoebe had brought one more thing. She set a standard envelope on the floor beside the cake box, the kind that comes from a financial institution, with the return address of the credit bureau in the upper left corner. She said it had come to her campus mailbox because I had listed her as a secondary contact during the investigation. She hadn't opened it. She said she thought I should be the one to do that. I opened it while they were still there. The letter was 1 page. It confirmed that all fraudulent accounts had been reviewed, verified, and permanently removed from my credit file. At the bottom, in the standard language these letters always use, it said my record had been restored to its pre-dispute status. I read it twice and folded it along its original creases. I thought about the night of the string lights. I thought about the video Cody posted, the one where they were all raising glasses in the living room while I was loading the last box into my car. They had been so certain, in that moment, that removing me solved something. That I was the source of the friction instead of the person quietly holding the structure together while the friction accumulated. 30 envelopes had answered that question more clearly than anything I could have said at the dinner table. My mother sent a text message sometime in the weeks that followed. It was brief. She said she would like to talk when I was ready. I read it and didn't delete it. I also didn't answer, not because I was punishing her, but because I didn't yet know what talking would mean or what I would want from it, or whether what she was prepared to offer was something I actually needed. Forgiveness, I had come to understand, doesn't have a fixed shape. It doesn't require a particular conversation or a particular outcome. Sometimes it's just the decision to stop carrying a debt that was never yours to begin with. I put the credit bureau letter in the top drawer of the small dresser I had bought that week. I turned the small key in the lock and left it there. Then I walked back to the living room, where Renee was trying to get the last of the frosting off her paper plate, and Phoebe was telling Monica something funny that had happened in her sociology class. The Grand River was visible through the big windows, dark and steady in the evening light, moving the way rivers move, not toward anything in particular. Just continuing. I sat down on the floor with the people who had shown up when I had nothing left to offer them, and I stayed there for the rest of the night. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't paying for the privilege of being in the room. If this story stayed with you, it might be because you recognize something in it, not necessarily the details, but the feeling. The feeling of giving and giving until someone finally asks you to stop, and calling that betrayal. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to put your name only on the things you actually chose. And you are allowed to build a life that belongs to you. If you found value in this story, subscribe to this channel. We share stories like this every week, because sometimes the most important thing is simply knowing you are not alone in what you've been through.